Okay, so you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. Thank you all for listening. It is the AMA, the four-way AMA with Matthew, Brian, Cameron, and me. My name is Alice. I am the temporary host for, I think, the last time here today. I do think we could have included plenty of other people in this episode if we could have handled the scheduling. Really, SLEERICKETS has many more co-hosts than just us, I think. I want to thank everybody who sent in questions. It means a lot. It's always a bit scary when you put something like this out into the world and then you wait and there's crickets. I think I can speak for all of us when I say they were really great questions and we had a lot of fun, maybe too much fun, coming up with answers. And at some points, we might even accidentally give you some good advice. Let's do it.
Why do I wear headphones?
You're not wearing headphones.
I know, and it's great. Why do I usually wear headphones?
Because sometimes there'll be a bit of feedback.
Do you hear it?
I don't actually, which is really good. But now I'm a bit like, oh, maybe we should make you
Maybe I
put
should
them
put on headphones. Because the reason I'm wearing headphones, typically, I'm speaking in the present progressive about the past, but the reason one wears headphones is because that means the sound doesn't come from the speakers from my computer, which then goes back into the mic and makes the conversation terrible. But you're not hearing that feedback?
It does. No, but I feel like this might not be the episode to experiment.
Okay, sounds good. I'll put them on when Matthew shows.
Cameron,
C-Town, how you
are
doing?
you there? C-Town.
Hello.
C-Town.
Hello.
I forget, why does everybody call you C-Town?
No one calls me. Just you. Just you 1 second ago calls me that. Let's. I've never heard that in my life. That's
disappointing. I was so hoping everybody called you C-Town and you had an explanation for why. And sometimes they make their voice go low. Yeah, sometimes they go C-Town.
C-Town.
You know what I mean? Like if you do something especially like indicative of your personality, right? They'll go C-Town.
C-Town in the house.
Yeah.
I've missed you, Brian, and your fantastical worlds of imagination.
Yeah.
They're quite entertaining.
Hey, there he is. Oh my God, we're actually going to do this, you guys.
Yeah, tell me if my audio fucks up.
G.
No, you sound great so far. You sound like better than you ever have.
Well, you gotta do it for the. Do you say armor? You do say armor out loud. I've only seen it initialized. You say armor. You say the initialism is a word, right? Or is that ammer?
You say what you want.
Aimer?
You say what you want, C-Town. Hey, Matthew.
Matthew, C-Town's here.
Not an acronym.
C-Town.
C-Town may soon kill himself.
That's so extreme.
It's reasonable. It's reasonable.
Yeah.
No, now you need to put a trigger warning. Alice, did you do your trigger warning?
Yeah, I did all of the warnings. Does anyone have a hard out? Does anyone need to leave at a certain time?
I have a neurological limit of, an hour 45 or 2 or at the most.
We could definitely make it less than 2, I reckon.
You might need to adjust that for time spent with Cameron, though. I think it may bring that.
Sorry, who's Cameron?
Who's Cameron?
Nicole Andrew.
Oh, well, Siri was telling me about Ariane. I was making a joke that I don't know who Cameron is. I only know who C-Town is. But Siri decided to interrupt and tell me about Ariane Andrew, American professional wrestler.
They sort of renamed me in this sort of nightmarish podcasting type ceremony thing. It's
there were tiki torches.
I was taken by surprise.
Nice. Jews will not replace Cameron, like that kind of thing. Let's see.
that kind of thing.
So are we all ready to express opinions on poets I've never read? Yep. Are we just going to go around and say what
favorite
we feel
dream songs
are the best and works of poets I've never read?
Yeah, I'm going to have some very disappointing answers to some of these questions. I know personally.
I've completely forgotten all the questions. So,
That's such typical C-Town. That's great.
Matthew, do you want to ask the questions or do you want me to ask the questions?
Actually, yeah, why don't you because if you're going to be editing this, you should decide what order to ask them in. And yeah,
Cool. Okay. Well, I'm just going to ask them in the order that you sent them to us in.
But hang on, I thought that Alice was a great editor because she was a great editor, but she told me that the only person who thinks she's a great editor is Matthew, and other people think she's a great editor because she knows how to do music. So I'm not interested in that having that conversation. But like, can you do music in this episode?
No, no one
But
can
in
do music. There's no music.
Yeah, Alice is quite a good editor. The place to really actually hear that in action is her podcast, because she will slice up like 40 different conversations with different people and a bunch of clips from movies and music and blend and splice and combine them in an effective way to produce this sort of like 40-minute tone poem. The problem with Sleep Rickets episodes is that they get converted now to YouTube videos. I don't get the YouTube podcast on YouTube thing. It just shows a Sleep Rickets logo for an hour, but that is a thing people are into apparently. So whatever, it automatically happens. The problem is that YouTube is extremely draconian about specifically copyrighted music recordings. So they have bots that will pick up on 3 seconds of, a Bob Dylan song and boot your whole account. So unfortunately, main feed Sleep Rickets episodes can't have music on them now. I've gone back and actually pulled the handful that did have music from the past. This has nothing to do with actual fair use, which for the most part, like it is fair to use like a little clip of something, particularly in context. But just because of the YouTube thing, that makes it tough on main feed Sleep Rickets episodes. But no, Alice, listen to actual Poetry Says episodes, particularly the ones that are not like a straight ahead interview, but are sort of like one of Alice's, like lyric essay episodes. Those I think showcase her editing best.
I listen to Alice's show all the time. Go fuck yourself. What, you think you've got
Okay.
some
Well, then what?
proprietary relationship with Alice?
I didn't know that.
Out for not realizing she was a good editor. So you have
No,
no.
I'm saying
out
you're
now.
the only one who thinks she's a good editor. I think that she's a totally capable professional editor, but you're always going on about how she's the best editor in town.
Why don't we have a different discussion?
I have tried to edit podcast episodes and you haven't, so you don't know how fucking hard it is.
Finally, we found a difference between you and me.
Wow.
The only one.
Okay, I'm going to go to the questions now.
Are we asking each other questions at the end, or did I make that up in my head?
You made it up in your head, but that sounds fun.
I have some cruel questions.
Okay.
Oh, good. Let's make that the whole episode.
Tempting. But no, thank you to everyone who sent in questions. We're going to start with Greg's question.
Greg.
Do any of you compose with pen, pencil, and paper? Any thoughts on the difference between composing by hand versus by typing?
How is that any of Greg's business?
Yeah.
What makes Greg think he has access to our processes?
Probably like the title of the episode. Just ask me anything,
Yeah, but it says,
hey, Greg, how do you?
Don't have to respond.
Yeah. The hell is wrong with you, Greg? That's kind of intrusion into our lives, is this?
I mean, I can answer personally, like seldom, but sometimes. But basically with poems, I will compose poems on paper sometimes. More often what I'll do is compose poems in my head and then write something down on paper when I get to it. But one of the advantages of writing short poems in, strict metrical or rhyming constraints is that they're easy to memorize and they're slow to write. So I can mostly do those in my head. But
you happy now, Greg? Does that satisfy you? You ready to go? You pleased you asked that question?
I think I will add that I only do that very occasionally, compose with pen and paper. But I feel like composing on a laptop means that I start editing before I've actually got a first draft down, which is kind of a problem. I do think there's a myth or like a sense out there that digital composition is somehow less virtuous and like you're more artistic if you have a beautiful moleskin and write your feelings in it.
I have a hideous yellow legal pad Like that's what I write by hand. It's very unaesthetic. It's very sloppy. Something I wonder a little bit about, and I think this might affect like long prose writing more than poetry. But I wonder a little bit, Brian, sometimes about revision. Like there's sort of like there are opinions that are very silly to have when you're young, and then start to like I find like I often will come back around to those opinions much later. Like when you're very young and
Oh,
naive as a writer,
reassuring.
you think like I just need to let it all flow out of me, and I don't want to contaminate it with any editing or any revision. I just need to let it be the true impulse that emerged from my spirit. And that's a very silly and naive way to think about writing. But now I sometimes do think, like both with my own writing and with others' writing, that like there is something to the sort of not that it's a totally first draft, but like there's something to the sort of the whole thing birthed from one writer, which when it is discussed and revised, with in conversation with it, like even like a thoughtful editor, not even like by committee, but like with a reasonable editor, there is sometimes something that is really lost, and that I don't like. Part of me thinks like now that I kind of there is something to the weird singular production of a single mind creating in isolation that is a little bit precious. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree with
Like
that.
obviously, typing on a computer makes that kind of revision way easier, and so we do it a lot.
Yeah, totally. And I don't write by hand. I don't write as fast as I think, and I don't see that as a value. Some people say that they writing by hand makes them slow down their thoughts, and that's beneficial to word choice or logical progression. I don't feel that way. I feel like, especially in first draft, being able to keep up with my thoughts is valuable, and sort of letting that, forgive the earnestness, but like flow state, potentially begin. I did literally, like write drunk and edit sober, as some saying used to go when 20
It's
years ago.
attributed to Hemingway.
It is. I don't, yes, it is. I think everything's attributed to Hemingway. So
Right.
it's hard, it's
It's
hard
like
to,
an internet quote. It's like Einstein,
right,
Lincoln, Hemingway. Right. Yeah.
exactly. It's hard to know what's apocryphal now, but I can't really drink anymore because of medical issues. And I wish sometimes when I'm not able to like get into the flow of something, I sort of long for the days where I could knock back a bottle of wine and just like see what came out and then pick the paragraph that seemed to have some energy to it, which is exactly as you say, where like when I was a ridiculously young person, I did it because I thought that was fun and made the time go quicker and made me surprise myself, and I didn't write with inhibitions. And after that sort of felt like the youthful folly, but now I'm feeling it again. Like I that type of ability to tap my subconscious, I'm feeling less capable of doing. And I sort of wish I had a cheat code in the way that a bottle of wine used to be.
Yeah.
For me, it was cigarettes more than booze. But
Cameron, can you tell us about how you compose?
Are we talking about writing on keyboards, or are we talking about writing while intoxicated at this point? And I need to like
Either, both.
which you want me to
Oh,
address? I can vaguely write when I'm intoxicated. I don't know. I can't. I get too drunk quite quickly, and then I can't write. At a very low level of inebriation, I can write, but I don't do it often. I mostly write when I'm sober. I mean, there are other like I can write on hallucinogens, but they're not. It's not particularly interesting, especially not as a first draft. I don't. I do find it amusing because I've never had, I mean, it's a sided thing, people writing on paper. So I do find it amusing, all the sort of masturbatory gushing about the sort of pencil to page thing in sort of artistic circles. Not with you guys, but just, in general, it's just sort of an amusing luxury. And I think it's mostly bullshit. I mean, I was just thinking about this vaguely because I was reading a lot of essays about Dickinson's fascicles recently, that sort of tiny little leaf together books she made of her own writings, and how sort of the sort of post Susan Howe movement has been very obsessed with presenting Dickinson as a visual poet, which is mostly bullshit. I mean, Dickinson is a verbal as a sort of verbal genius far beyond the sort of visual ephemera of her work. But I agree that she's visual to some extent, but I think it's this idea that she didn't want to be published because she was a visual artist and she didn't want her stuff read aloud or not considered without the sort of bounds of it being seen on an envelope, I think is bullshit. But yeah, no, I mean, I write when I can on a machine, mostly sober and sometimes inebriated, and I think maybe surprisingly out of the group, I have the most boring answer to the whole thing. So
It's not
yeah,
boring.
that's
Yeah.
me.
Well, Greg is not satisfied yet. He has 2 more questions. Second one is,
Good God.
are there any poets or writers you want to like but can't, and or ones you do like but wish you didn't? And he also adds, by want, I don't just mean think you should for dutiful reasons of canon formation or whatever.
I wish I liked Dickens, Charles Dickens, because there's just so much of it out there, and
You would have so much fun stuff to read if it were good to read to you.
right,
If
right,
that were good,
like
if you liked it,
there's
boy, you'd be so rich.
exactly, and like not only that, but it seems like the people who like it like really get a kick out of it, like really like it, and I've
Yeah.
given it, I've read a few of his novels. I've started a few of his novels. I've read one of his novels, and I don't like them. I'm not tickled by them. I'm not interested in the plot. I don't like them. So that's someone I continue to go back to with hope that in a new stage of my life I will like. In terms of a writer I like and wish I didn't, I don't I mean that goes back to a guilty pleasure conversation that we've had at a previous AMA where I don't really believe in guilty pleasures. Like I find it kind of silly that Dave Eggers is one of my favorite writers because there's some kind of like connotation to that, and A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius has like a silly title. So I sometimes squirm when I admit that I really think when he's not writing earnestly about other people's stories, he's one of the best prose writers of his generation. But no, I wish I liked Dickens, and I'm happy with who I like.
Yeah, my feeling mostly is like I get excited by things I like, and then I get annoyed by things I don't like, especially if they are praised a lot. But as far as writers I wish I liked, probably the best answer I can offer is Robert Penn Warren, who is a writer. I've spent a lot of time with it, more with his poetry than with his prose, though I did like All the Kingsmen quite a lot. And I've read a fair number of his essays, some very good essays. His poetry, there are bits and pieces of it that really stand out, but there's very little that I ever feel compelled to go back and reread, even though I've written like a number of critical essays about him, mostly because Ryan, as well as a number of other people I know, are really devoted to him and are in fact members of the Robert Penn Warren Circle. And they have a conference every year where they get together and talk about how great Robert Penn Warren is. And it always feels a little bit to me like, I mean, I guess like I think it's probably true is that a lot of them genuinely just take direct, unalloyed pleasure in his writing. I always feel like it's impressive, and he has this sort of odd talent, and there's amazing stuff in there, but it seldom comes together really in anything like a satisfying way. It almost always feels overlong, and it just seems like he was too indulged in some direction or another. I mean, it's a little bit the way I felt like reading, and I've read way less of his, so I shouldn't say that, but like I read Humboldt's Gift, which is a Saul Bellow novel, and I know it's much celebrated, and he's much celebrated. And reading it and thinking like, wow, there's so much in here that's amazing. What a fucking mess this is. Like, what a ridiculous mess of a novel this is. It's like 4 different novels all like car crashed together in an entertaining but sort of incoherent way that loses the thread and picks it up back up again. It's like 3.5 different Shaggy Dog stories. In that case, I felt a little bit more like discipline was the problem. With Warren, it feels like it's like definitely discipline is a problem, but there's also maybe just he isn't quite as good as he ought to be. I don't know. Or maybe the problem is just me.
Cameron, does anything come to mind for you?
Sure. I mean, I find the second part of the question hard than the first. I mean, the first recently, Edwin Arlington Robinson is really, I've been reading a lot of him, and I sort of do quite struggle to like him, and I wish I liked him a little more than I did, because I think there is sort of a lot of people I admire like him, and I think there's certainly
You and
a
I should
lot
talk
of
about him at some point, Cameron, because I just finished his selected.
yeah, we can talk about him. Yeah, that's the list of episode ideas I keep sending to you and I'm never acting on. But like, yeah, no, we should do that. But yeah, no, I mean, he is very I find his concerns very sympathetic. Often find his verse technique and his compression techniques and his linguistic techniques very unsympathetic often. And I think this often causes a kind of less disinterest and more kind of rupture between interest and attention, maybe. Whitman, I wish I liked Whitman more than I did, for one reason being that all the new formalists hate Whitman. And so me saying I like Whitman is always amuses me. And I do really like short Whitman, but any of his long poems are far too long. And I tire, and his language doesn't hold me very much for very long periods of time often. And I go back to Dickinson and I find everything that's missing in Whitman and more. Let me think. Who else? I agree with Brian about Dickens, although I don't know if I wish I liked Dickens more. Maybe I wish I liked Dickens more a little bit, but I don't massively care. I've been reading the short stories of Heinrich von Kleist or Heinrich von Kleist. I don't fucking know. And he wrote one of my favorite theological essays would be to put into a box. So I'll just say one of my favorite essays ever on the marionette theater. But I've been reading his short stories, and I wish I liked them. I wish they made me feel less bored. They feel like sort of underbaked Kafka, to be honest, stylistically more than conceptually. I'm just sort of listing people. The more interesting question is, who do I feel guilty about liking? And that's very, very few. Sometimes I feel a little guilty about liking for Elena Ferrante as much as I do, because I'm not completely convinced that she's as great a prose writer as sort of previous great prose writers have been. But I do like her very much. There's books that I find very entertaining, and I don't think they're great books, and I don't think they're very well written, but I find them very entertaining, and I often have a sort of impulse to read them instead of books that I know are better written. Like I read Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas recently, which is just sort of very funny fast food, and I felt slightly guilty that I was having so much fun with it when I could have been reading, what was it? Oh, and then I was supposed to read The Secret Agent by Conrad, and I read Fear and Loathing first, and I felt slightly guilty for Conrad. But I mean that kind of book.
Swine.
Hmm?
No, I just called you swine. You're being Philistinic, surrendering to your urges to read
Yeah.
Thompson instead of Joseph Conrad.
Yeah, don't
Yeah,
feel
yeah,
guilty. It's a waste of time.
I mean, yeah, that's also the problem with the question. I really don't feel that much guilt. I mean, I'm being slightly melodramatic. But yeah, no, again, that's sort of my boring answer. Yeah, there's very few writers who I think of as guilty pleasures. There's singers, I guess, I think of as guilty pleasures, but I think I take music a lot less seriously than writing. So I think like seriously, not in a pretentious way, but seriously less in a kind of centralized to my thinking and very perceptive way. So it's not like I don't think you should feel guilt about writers that you admire. And I think like I think there's a difference between liking a writer and thinking that writer has sort of an inimicable genius, which sort of raises them up to a certain group of writers with a specific genius. I think you can admire and like a writer very much, but also know that in some ways they are less emotionally revealing and less stylistically reality making than other writers, and still like them very much. I think there can be another confusion when you sort of elevate that kind of writer to that group, and I'd call that maybe overrating. But I think that's not what I'm doing, so I don't feel particular guilt. People say they feel guilt about who's that guy? He's like a famous poet, and he talks about fucking women and cars a lot. And it begins with an S. Yeah.
Seidel?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, yes. People feel guilty about liking Seidel, and I don't. I don't mind Seidel. I don't love him, but I don't mind him. I don't feel guilty about it. I think he's fine as it goes. He's better than
You
most,
would
but that's
sooner
sort of
make public your Audible Wrapped than your Spotify Wrapped, is what I'm gathering.
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, the poet who I like but sort of wish I didn't is Anthony Hecht. The next question is for Matthew about his
By the way,
H's.
I didn't even realize you liked him. I knew you hated him, but like you also liked him some, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Matthew bought me his early collected poems, and I really, really love some of them, and he's really wonderful. But my God, I don't want to be a woman in any Anthony Hecht poem ever.
That's why he's dead. If he were alive, I would not have given that book to you. I will say, whatever that means. But like the comfort as you read it is, you dead motherfucker. The martini goes to the martini.
That's actually entertaining because actually I forgot Hecht is another poet who I wish I liked much more than I do.
Mm-hmm. All right, Matthew, you got to answer about your H's. You just have
to.
Yeah. What's up with it?
Okay, so this is Greg's question for Matthew only. When reading poems, you often pronounce the H in English words beginning with WH, what, when, while, but you generally don't do this when you're speaking conversationally with guests on the podcast. Is this intentional? Is there a reason behind the variation? Yeah, I mean, the reason is that there's nothing like, all right, so there's a line that my teacher, I had about 1 million classes with as an undergrad, creative writing classes, Brian Henry, is an experimental poet, editor, Australiana poetryophile, hates and hated me always. Like I took like 8 classes with him and with an intern for him, and he hated me the whole way through. But smart guy. And the epigraph to his first book was a line from my favorite Camus novel, The Fall. The line is, the whole novel, if you haven't read it, is a monologue by a guy in a bar. I mean, it starts in a bar and ends up going elsewhere. He goes on a walk. But there's a great line. He says, he's talking about his life back in Paris before he left and everything went to hell and he moved to Amsterdam. The line is, yes, no creature was more natural than I. And this is before he has this major, crisis and everything, all of his illusions about himself come shattering to the ground. So I am a very unnatural person. Nothing about my speech or pronunciation is in any way natural. Almost all of it is a sort of a patchwork of different rules and imperatives picked up from different people at different times. I had a second grade teacher who insisted that it was barbaric to say because, since it included the word pause in it. You should always say because. Which I do unless I'm speaking quickly, because it's not actually a natural pronunciation. It's something my second grade teacher beat into my head, along with saying either and neither rather than either and neither. My dad wanted very much for us to lose our Southern accents. I was a drama major. I also, when I started reading aloud to my daughters, I became obsessive about how I pronounced words, not because pronunciation matters, but because I wanted them to understand what words I was saying. And so I became hyper self-conscious about pronunciation. And then when I read aloud on the podcast, I basically have a series of rules and heuristics for like how I approach every individual thing I say when I'm reading aloud. Whereas if I'm speaking, it's less considered. But yeah, I'm a completely I am basically like how 1 minute before the end of the second section of 2001, like as the memory blocks start being removed from his mainframe, like I'm just a series of rules stacked up and sort of barely holding together moment to moment. I have no native impulse. I like if it gives you any idea, I am somebody who has very frequently throughout my life in conversation been accused of lying when I was not lying because the way I spoke seemed so phony and not convincing when I was telling the truth. So yeah, maybe that's probably as good an answer as I can offer.
Wow, I'm glad we got that answer. I'm glad we got that question. I'm going to
Great question.
Yeah, great question. I'm going to move on pretty quickly because we do have a lot of questions. This next one's really good. Not that those first ones were bad, Greg.
Fuck you, Greg.
I really like this next question.
That third question, Greg really redeemed himself. I was listening to the first two questions. I thought, what a fucking piece of shit this Greg guy must be.
No.
And then totally, that's what I was thinking. And then the third question, I was like, whoa, Grego, good
G-Town.
question. I'd like to hang out with this guy. So, Greg, I apologize for thinking you are a big piece of shit. And now I think you're really a great guy.
Almost as good as Joel. Who's going to ask the next question?
Okay.
Carry
Oh my
on,
God.
Alice.
All right. Okay. So this next question is from Joel. What can writers do to create the more honest environments that we want? Is the tactic to give honest feedback at readings and conferences, even when it's not desired? Is the solution more podcasts like SLEERICKETS? Should we create our own reading series? And he says, I'm genuinely curious to hear what everyone has to say because I don't know what I think myself. I can relate to the feeling that conversations about poetry often feel stale because people feel they have to hold back. However, I don't think the other extreme of trolling haters or poetry tribalism is desirable either. It seems difficult to establish a community that would be both exciting and healthy. I want to try to answer this one first because I feel like at the moment I live in a community that might not be entirely honest, but it is exciting and healthy enough. The first thing I would say is do not give honest feedback unless somebody asks you to, and even then.
I love the idea of giving unsolicited negative feedback at a poetry reading.
Yeah, no, absolutely do not do that. Do not ever do that. Trust is the critical thing here, and creating environments where you can have trust with other people and where it can grow, and it has to grow over time. You can't just tell people this is a safe space and then have that be true. And I think that creating environments like that means you have to start with people who are willing to bring people together and not put their own status at the center of the thing. So I'm part of a couple of reading groups. They're both run by people who are willing to organize a space, show up every week or every month, and through that repetition, we get to know each other and we start to trust each other. And when you have that, then you can start to talk honestly and kindly. Kindly is important. But yeah, trust doesn't come through a reading series that's just all about the MC being amazing. And it can't exist at something like a conference ever because people haven't been around each other long enough, and a conference is about status. So there will be no trust.
No, conference is the worst place to try to find honest conversations about poetry. Yeah, the solution is more podcasts like SLEERICKETS. The solution is really just SLEERICKETS, and just more SLEERICKETS is really that's the real solution.
Yeah, we don't want more. We don't want competitors.
I
You
think
want a
that there
Spotify deal.
are, I mean, maybe 3 people I'm honest with about their writing, maybe.
Who are
I
they? Who?
Probably just 3 people I went to graduate school with. Probably just Andrew Palmer, John Carrillo, and Matthew Buckley Smith. I can't, everyone else, I couldn't imagine what like, because in order to be honest with somebody, you need to respect them and their work
Mm.
enough that there's some value to that honesty. You need to think that there's like actual potential of their ability to take your advice and improve their work with it. You have to not be worried about offending them. You have to be willing to put in the real hours and hours to do the work to provide valuable feedback. And just to hit all of those with the same person, it's very, very difficult. So I don't I think a lot of people think I give them honest feedback, and I don't. I give them compliments and then 1 or 2 pieces of advice, which they can take or leave in a sort of casual way, because the process of like ruthless, honest feedback, it just requires too many prerequisites, I think. Do you disagree with that?
No, you're making yourself very vulnerable, and you're making a commitment when you give that kind of feedback.
Yeah, I mean, you could detonate a friendship really easily with this kind of thing. Like that's whether you're talking about somebody's writing or even like the stuff that they like, the stuff that they are into. You could really fuck some shit up. So yeah, I think you're right. I think there has to be a lot in place. But I just keep coming back to this thing of trust, and I think trust is really slow. It's a slow thing.
I'm also Joel, and Joel writes in a lot and has I appreciate in part particularly because I think he has sort of overlapping but fairly different tastes from mine and a different perspective and kind of background and worldview. I I think that because one of your questions was should we create our own reading series, and I think the implication to that question is like, oh well, the existing reading series and conferences and publications are seem not honest. So why don't we create our own? And I think that like that's great. And what I would just say is like I think you will learn a lot about this problem if you start your own reading series.
Yeah, you will learn about how the problem just replicates itself.
Exactly how complicated it is and how much it is not just a matter of picking good and not picking bad. Because it's actually got to be a human event with real people.
Yeah.
Like, people have to be there and they have to keep coming back, not only when it's their reading or it's their friend, and they have to be in the place that you're in and want to. I mean, yeah, at some point, Cameron, I thought some of these questions and Mara's questions included made me think that maybe you and I should just say a word about the magazine, but I do think there's this sort of funny. There's a funny pattern that develops where you find camaraderie with people whose perspectives line up with yours. You feel like, oh, I'm kind of in the wilderness. I have this feeling about the bulk of things, the mainstream, and I feel at odds with it in this way. Oh, you also feel at odds with it in this way. Let's get together. We find comfort in talking to each other about it. But then once you form that community, then you start to want to preserve it, and you start to want to play the consensus game, right? Not because you're being dishonest, but because we're social creatures, and it is hard to maintain. Setting aside the difficulty of being honest with somebody about his own writing, it's remarkably difficult to be honest, about to be sort of clear, not just honest, but clear-headed about others' writing in conversation. Cameron, you and Elijah and I had a sort of a hostile moment over WhatsApp recently because he and I were criticizing a one thing said by Merve Emre, who's your old professor. And I think we had a reasonable conversation about it and kind of sorted it out. But what came up is I think in multiple directions, we have had moments where one or the other of us has spoken really critically or even sort of sneeringly about somebody who's either the other people in the group are friends with or admire or feel a special connection to, and it's tricky. And the easy thing to do, the polite thing to do, but not the natural thing to in some ways to do is just not to bother to say the harsh thing about somebody that the other guy in the room often gets drinks with. It is difficult even to maintain conversation about other writers that is honest once you start to get into a comfortable groove with people that you've established a comradely consensus with.
Yeah. I think that's true. I have a lot of responses to this question. In that case specifically, I think also what the problem is not exactly that people are being honest, is that people's problems often are built along certain sort of lines or snags of argument they find particularly annoying. So it's not even that people can be honest about someone and that will send people off. It's that people will make a kind of critique that is not just interrogative of someone that the other person likes, but also plays into a certain field of critique that other person has had previously negative experiences in the past. So it's not even just that honesty is a problem. It's more that each human being comes to their understanding of honesty imbued with a certain set of previous experiences and negative and positive stimuli, each tinging each experience, which then allows a sort of over and under interpretation of every other human being's discourse. So it's not even the pure honesty of the problem. It's more honesty coupled along with internal biased perception management that sort of leads to these things. I do feel that in sort of the context, that specific context, I think I'm not really sure if that sort of should ring alarm bells for the whole idea that even close friends can be honest. I think there's a difference between being honest and that occasionally causing disagreements and then that being fixed, and being honest and causing calamitous damage to relationships. I think that's when I think honesty is risky, but I think it's also very rewarding, and that one should sometimes, the risks are not insurmountable in comparison to the reward factor. Those are my instantaneous thoughts. My thoughts to the question, I mean, I have two thought streams. My first thought stream is something along the lines of, I'm a whole lot less interested in this whole idea of setting up a living community than I think a lot of you are, because I think the poetry world suffers greatly from communities anyway. And if people started worrying a little more about how they could form a community with the dead, and just sort of listen to the dead more and read more of them, and instead of sort of thinking about how they can make a reading series out of their friends and sustain that, then I think the whole business of the poetry community, and in many ways, including honesty, would be greatly healed. And I think this whole idea of sort of the ephemera, I think a community of the living is great and all, but I think at this point in time, we've completely shit on the idea of a community of the dead. And I think that is really if you go back through history, apart from maybe the Romantics, most great poets were not particularly interested in making reading series. I'm going to say it. And I think that's a bit of an overstatement and a bit of a simplification of the actual reality. I'll immediately admit that. But I think there is a kind of granule of truth in that sort of slightly pompous and oversimplistic remark. But so that's my immediate response to the question. My response in criticism is, but yeah, I do think I've been thinking about this a lot recently, because I've just got myself into a workshop thing with two people, one of whom is a good friend of mine and one of whom I don't know at all. And we sent each other poems, and I'm still trying to work out how to respond. And I think it's also interesting because, I have great experience of workshopping with strangers on the internet. And in some ways that does allow one to be much more vulnerable, because not is there a sort of, I don't give a fuck factor if you do upset someone. There's also a factor of it seems to me that honesty sort of operates on both sides of the spectrum. Either you're so close with someone that you can be optimally vulnerable and open and harsh about their own writing in a utilitarian sense, or you can be so distant from the recipient that you can kind of attain a kind of unemotionally inflected objectivity about the writing, or at least an objectivity obviously mired in your own sort of personal subjective tastes, but a kind of objectivity that allows you to be honest, maybe in a malicious way, but also in a better, just in a purely sort of neutral manner, or even in a positive manner for the work. But I think at those two ends of the spectrum are the spectrum's very fucking vast between those two delimitations. And I think it's sort of getting a certain amount of honesty whenever you are in any other part of the spectrum apart from those two ends, which is really sort of a difficult thing.
What occurs to me is that you are still in grad school living in a house of roommates. And my guess is that in part what that means is that you're less lonely. You are less in need of a community that you might get from poetry than some of us sad middle-aged poets are. But I actually think that doesn't mean you're wrong. It might mean you're more right. There is an idea that's become fashionable recently. I can't remember who coined the term luxury beliefs. There's an idea that if you exist in a position of privilege, then it's possible to have certain beliefs about the world that you couldn't have if you had more trying circumstances, and therefore those beliefs are not valid. And I tend to think very often the opposite is true, that it is when you're not in a foxhole that you have the perspective to say, well, well, maybe this poetry community stuff is trying to find community in the wrong place. The luxury of like ready social life that you have at this stage in your life might make it easier for you to see more clearly that finding community in poetry is probably a dangerous pursuit.
Yeah, I think that's true to an extent, but I would like to comment that in my real life, there is one person who is anywhere sort of near the knowledge levels of poetry that I have, maybe two other people that will talk to me that I sort of live in the same country as, and everyone else who I'm friends with has no interest in sort of that kind of, in basically any form of literature, mostly at all. So I mean,
No,
I think you're right, but I think it's slightly
you're
more
you're
nuanced.
finding community in one place and poetic dialogue in a different place, and
Yeah,
that's
then
probably
sure.
better.
Right. Yeah, then sure. I think you're probably right. Yeah, I have no objection to that idea. I think it's probably true. Yeah. No, yeah.
This next question is also very good. This is from Maura. Other than read, and practice, what advice can you give about cultivating a critical eye? How do you keep yourself immune to the voices of the literati? Maybe this is a question about trusting and strengthening your own poetic aesthetic. So kind of the opposite of the last question. If you're going to be in that community, how do you stay sane?
I mean, Matthew and I share an abhorrence of advice or wisdom. So I think that it's in an ask me anything. It's a sort of bad perspective from which to begin. I don't think one can cultivate a poetic or literary eye in any way other than reading and writing. I think it's a bit of a trick question. The idea of a literati made me giggle a little bit because
Yeah, same.
I think anybody who is trying to seek out wisdom from like contemporaries who are popular thinkers should probably stop reading those people. I think that there's only damage to be done by actively seeking influence by influencers. But beyond that, I find a couple people you enjoy chatting about this stuff with and experiment articulating your outlandish vision of the world and see if they agree or disagree. But I don't have any real advice. I think anybody offering advice is probably an asshole.
In some defense of the question, I'll just say, like, if you have a lot of experience in writing and publishing and reading and writing and knowing writers and corresponding about all the stuff, it is a little bit easier to gain some confident cynicism about official avenues of approval. And it's a
Yeah.
little easier to be like, well, this is a very celebrated book, but it's actually not that great. And like, this person's friends with this person, and this person has a lot of relationships in New York and is attractive and went to school here. And so, but I think like I try to be aware of like, when am I susceptible to that same, like, if a publication, if I run into a piece of poetry publication that comes out of like a much more ragged DIY world, like Matt Wall, lives in, is there a part of me that is sort of primed to think of it dismissively? And I think that probably is there. Like, I think there's certain kinds of like, finishing line press kind of shittily formatted books with very shiny covers that I will pick up and think like, this is probably not worth my time. And it's going to be like, I think we are probably all susceptible to some degree to like what has been officially approved of. I think like, in a way, the purest reader I know, Cameron, might be you. And in part, I think this because like, you will, anytime you send me something to read, it's the most like hostile, deformatted block of like 9-point, prose with no spaces and a bunch of like wingdings in the middle of every other word, because it's all sort of copy paste. Like, you read everything through your machine, and so like you truly like strips away all of the presentation, and it's really nothing but the words in a row. So you may be least susceptible to this, Cameron. I don't know.
You can be biased through other things than presentation, though. I presume, like, it's not just presentation
Yeah.
that can make you biased.
But that's not the question, right? The question is, how do you give advice about cultivating one's critical eye?
What does that mean?
I agree. That was where I was gonna try to rephrase, where like, is it
Like identifying what's good and what's not good.
I think what she's asking is about her own work. Like, how do you know whether what you've written is good or not? And how do you keep the voices of people like your teachers, fucking podcasters, other people out of your head so that you can write something that you actually like? That's how I take the question.
so I do have I do have an instinct about that, which is try to read and listen to as wide, try to be influenced by as wide a variety of inputs as possible. Not just styles of poetry, but various ways language is put together popularly and eruditely and conversationally and just everything else. I think the the larger the deluge there, the more just opportunity, because any of these definitions of critical eye imply that you want some precision or confidence in trying to determine what is good and what is bad, either in your own work or other people's work. And again, listening to an individual on that isn't helpful, but maybe listening to 1,000 individuals and just seeing what sticks or what rings true is better. But I'm not saying anything interesting there.
I mean, I agree though. I think like miring yourself in aesthetic schools is much less worthwhile than going out and miring yourself in the world for a while and then coming back to the work and seeing if it sort of holds up to sort of the weight of the experience that you've accrued. And I'm not sure that's a bit like that's not in any sense a very useful thing. And I'm not sure it's going to give you like you're not going to do that once and be like, oh, suddenly I understand every flaw in every line I've written. But I think it's going to have some positive effect on how the work is made and how it's bettered, because normally good poetry can be shown as good because you can kind of test it against sort of the experience you've lived and the experience you've encountered. And if it still seems worthwhile pursuing after you've sort of gone out and experienced the world, then there's probably some value in it, at least to yourself, that can be made. I mean, I guess the other way you could do it is go and find like Harold Bloom's Anxiety of Influence and read it and work out which sort of major poet you've subconsciously subsumed into a Freudian drama. And if you find out that you have done that, then you're probably going to be as great as Blake and Keats. And I mean, I'm joking, but like you could, I guess, do that, and that could give you some sort of delusional self-happiness. But like, I'm not sure one can develop a critical eye in literature without also developing a critical eye in how to just allow oneself to experience reality. Because I don't think you can detach getting good at writing stuff from just getting then living, because it's very hard to write good stuff if you're not living, at least interestingly. I don't think living well often makes good writing, but living to a kind of maximum often makes at least writing that has something to say. And not much writing these days does have something to say. So that's probably a good point. I mean, also maybe just find people who can rip your sort of poetic and literary worldviews apart. And if you can then sort of respond to that and construct that back up, you're probably doing something right, at least. I think like it's a hard question to answer, because it seems to me that just developing a sort of literarily critical eye is either something about being sort of living in the fashionable literary world. It's either about that or it's about writing good stuff. And I think writing good stuff is inseparably linked to living.
I totally disagree about living an interesting life. I
Same.
think living an interesting life
Same.
has value in itself. I think that's like perpendicular to writing good writing. Like it can coincide, it can be unrelated. I just think they're two separate things, separate values.
Sure. I mean, I'm not saying it is, or like there are certainly writers who don't. I mean, like I don't think this is a general rule. Like Dickinson is a very good example of someone who by money standards did not live an interesting life if you compare it to like Rambo. Like I'm not.
Apparently, she was
It's not.
having a lot of threesomes with the neighbors, I heard.
Well, yeah, that's that. But like, yeah, like it's. I'm also not talking about living an interesting life as going around the world and like going to fucking Africa. I mean, just like
Fuck
in
Africa,
like
says
yeah,
Cameron.
yeah, that's take that all. Fuck Africa.
Clip
It's a
it,
shit
clip
place.
it, put it on social.
Yeah, nuke it. No, I mean just like live just like living in reality, doing whatever the fuck is still living interestingly. I'm not saying interestingly accrues to any actual practical endeavor, but I'm just saying that like smothering yourself, especially in kind of contemporary aesthetics, and spending your entire time worrying about sort of which school or trend your poetry critically cleaves to, I don't think is gonna ever produce good poetry, or almost ever.
Yeah, definitely. Like reading chiefly contemporary poetry is not a good way to develop a good sense of what's good or bad. And like, I've talked about this some length in the Secret Show, but like, don't like read contemporary poetry, read whatever you want to read, but like the ballast of your reading should be old stuff. Like read old stuff, read against the grain, read different genres, read science writing, prose, poetry, dialogue, whatever, read against the grain, read different things, reread. If you loved something several years ago, reread it. Not every single thing, but like occasionally that'll help give you a sense of what you did or didn't perceive at the time. And I would say whether you write drunk and revise sober, I would say definitely revise cold. Like write hot and revise cold. Don't revise for a while. Set something aside, come back to it much later. Just as with rereading, I think you will see things a little bit more clearly. It is very easy to get caught up in the swirl of contemporary writing and then responding to that contemporary writing with your own contemporary writing. It's very easy in that way to lose your way, to lose your compass. So you do want to keep sort of refinding your north through through the old and the weird and the cold.
Before we move on to our fuck, marry, kill question, I just want to add to Maura, because I'm really interested in her use of the word literati there, just because I really empathize with that feeling of all these people are somehow like slightly more than human. And what I would say to her is, I got over that in a weird way, in that I like went to all their houses and talked to them for a couple of hours and interviewed them. But like in the process of doing that, they did all these really human things. Like they got nervous and they were irritable and they made mistakes and they said things that came out the wrong way and they tried to sound impressive and ended up sounding ridiculous. So I guess I'm just saying, trust me when I say that no one is the Vanity Fair photo shoot version of themselves. So you don't have to listen to them.
I had a conversation with my wife about a contemporary critic that she was very frustrated with, and the question I asked her was like, and this is, I think, goes for anybody you're worried about thinking of as the literati. I would say like the crucial test of a critical mind is like, I would say like these two things. Has this person informed you of a work or a writer that you did not otherwise know about, who's been really, really worth reading? Like, has this person pointed out somebody you would not otherwise have heard of, and that's been a great discovery for you? And or has this person offered a perspective that significantly changed the way you thought about like a work you already were familiar with? Mm-hmm. Like, if this person is not, if all this person does is authoritatively offer opinions, particularly if those opinions tend to line up with what is already mostly celebrated or disparaged, that's not a critic. Like, that's not actually somebody with a critical mind. This person has to offer something new to you, either like just giving you new wonderful things to read or helping you see things in a new way.
Does it have to be positive?
Positive? What do you mean positive?
Well, can they offer you a new way of seeing a work, but in a form of negative, like a new negative?
No, absolutely. Yeah. But I think like if the key is not that this person says, "Oh, this thing you like, it's actually bad to like that." No, that's not helpful. What's helpful is this thing you like. Here's something that's happening in it you might not have noticed that might change the way you think about it for good or ill. Like if it actually does change your perspective, that's worthwhile. If it even like showing you a new way. I mean, that's what I really want in a literary critic is not even to have myself persuaded. It's just to see like, oh, that is a way of reading. That is a perspective on work, on like this piece of writing that had never even occurred to me. I'd never thought about reading in this way or reading with this thing in mind. Whether or not I end up adopting it, just it's something new.
AMA. The second part, which you can find on the Secret Show feed, SLEERICKETS.substack.com, you can get a week for free if you sign up, is a lot sillier. A lot sillier. The thing you gotta know about your girl here is that she's a recovering stress bunny, and particularly if you give her a time limit. Yeah, I went into massive stress bunny mode while recording this. It was also 2:30 in the morning by the time we finished. And I usually go to bed at 9 p.m. These are all excuses. What I really need to say is I'm so sorry, Ethan. I forgot to introduce your questions properly. Just so everybody knows, when we begin this next part 2, we are starting out with Ethan's question, which is a fuck, marry, kill proposition. From there, we go into all kinds of directions. Brian launches a new podcast. I have a fight with Brian for no reason. And Cameron ends the show with a truly diabolical question, which I am still thinking about. This is either my last or my second last recording session doing the intro outro. Just finished the edit, just finished the show notes, and I just wanted to say I'm really going to miss doing this. I wanted to thank the people who've written to me while I've been in the chair for being so welcoming. The problem is that I really miss Matthew being in charge of this show. I keep going to my phone hoping for the new episode of SLEERICKETS and then realizing that I know exactly what's in it because I made it. I'm sure you miss Matthew just as much as I do, but don't worry, he is returning soon. And I really wanted to thank you, Matthew, for trusting me with this thing. It really means the world. It has been way too much fun driving the tricked out ute, but there's really only one guy who can floor it in this thing, and that's you. Thank you all for listening. One of the things that has become so clear to me getting to make this show for a little while is that there is a real community out there around SLEERICKETS, and if you are listening to this, you are part of it. You can reach Matthew and tell him that I am a complete Suki Lala for saying that at sleerickets@gmail.com, and with any luck, he will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.